Now, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its 18th day, diplomatic avenues appear to have stalled, with major security concerns around food security and the refugees becoming ever more prevalent globally.
Well, let's get an overview on the latest and talk to security expert Will Geddes. Good to see you this morning, Will. I mean, look, what's your assessment of where we are at this stage? I mean, we've got these humanitarian corridors which don't seem to be working particularly effective. We've got Putin having negotiations with world leaders but not getting anywhere. It can't come as much of a surprise.
No, I don't think it really comes as any surprise, Stephen. I think even the optimism that this was going to be a fast invasion by Russia shouldn't be necessarily seen as an optimistic aspect. I think a lot of analysts have looked at the situation and said, well, it would seem that Putin probably put in some of his softer troops, some of his younger, less experienced troops, to soften up the Ukrainian positions, to do the reconnaissance, to find out how they would resist. And now we're seeing a much stronger element and front of the Russian military beginning to move in. But inevitably, where the great concern is the fact that these humanitarian corridors, which are supposedly agreed in some form of a ceasefire, are just not being respected. But to cut off the supplies of food, water, electricity to various parts that they are taking was somewhat inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, do you think? I mean, I know he's not followed the sort of playbook that perhaps everyone was expecting at the beginning, but can you still see a pattern here in how he's operating?
Well, only in so much as I think initially a lot of people thought he was going to take the Donbass region. Luhansk and Donetsk were going to be the areas which were seen to be extremely pro-Russian, much like the Crimea, and these could have been taken and then annexed. But it's evident that he wants to take the entire country. He started trying to create or begin the startings of referendums, certainly in the northeast area. He has to take, obviously, Kiev if he needs to succeed. But whether succession or succeeding is really the key point here, because the Ukraine are certainly putting up an enormous resistance. Their fighters are putting up great resistance. You know, the comment yesterday about Russia seeing the supplies of armaments to Ukraine by the West as viable targets, well, I don't think that comes as any surprise to anybody.
No, I mean, admittedly, the West has been treading a bit of a fine line with that one, hasn't it? Look, the issue here would seem to be, I mean, and perpetually for Putin in all of this, even if he goes in, even if he decides to raise cities like Kiev to the ground, how on earth is he going to, in the long term, hold a country the size of Ukraine? Can he even attempt to?
I think it's going to be virtually impossible, Stephen. I think that the problem that we have here is this is simply going to move to an insurgency level. And he's had experience of that. In Georgia, has had experience in Chechnya. It's going to become incredibly messy. So his sort of outright everybody surrenders. There's no evidence of anybody in Ukraine, let alone the politicians, going to agree to that. This is going to become very, very messy. And where I think we've got to be very cautious is the supplies into Ukraine by the West, which are seen as viable targets, which, when we say viable targets, doesn't mean necessarily destruction. It could mean capture by Russia and utilize themselves or added to their armaments.
Will, what do you think is the best realistic outcome now? Because it's very difficult to see where this is going to go. As you say, most predictions at the beginning. If you take the speech that Putin gave, the hour-long monologue on the eve of invading the country, he set out effectively three criteria, didn't he? That Russia should never have given up Ukraine in the first place. It should always have belonged to Russia. That it was corrupt with a shrinking economy and he had to go in there and help the Ukrainians and to help the Russian inhabitants in Ukraine. And that he was threatened by the Western meddling on the border with missile positions and Ukraine flirting with the idea of joining NATO. In my mind, I keep going back to that speech and thinking, has he just changed those goalposts as he's got more emboldened and not being stopped? Or can we return to that and find some grain of how this might end?
Well, it's a great question, Bev, and I wish I had the answer to it. I think we have to look at all the component parts, and I think that speech, as you say, that Putin delivered was very, very revealing about potentially what his bigger plan was. I think in terms of a mission creep in moving into other non-NATO partner countries may have been hindered somewhat by Ukraine's resistance to this situation. But I can't see Ukraine relinquishing anything willingly to Putin. And I was having this conversation with someone yesterday. And the biggest challenge that you have with someone like Putin, who is a very powerful, very driven, very directed individual, whether that be a good thing or bad thing, and inevitably we are all deeming this to be bad, but, to be completely devil's advocate, there are two sides to every story, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. So we have to kind of drill down to find out exactly what it is Putin's objectives are, but look at some kind of concession that Ukraine would be willing to agree to. But I can't see that happening, if I'm absolutely honest with you. They're also stepping back from the Iran nuclear agreement with France and Germany. And he's made it very clear to Macron that he doesn't want to stop anytime soon in terms of his advances in Ukraine. So I wish I had that answer, Beth.
What about the China situation, Will, in all of this? Because obviously there's been a great deal of concern about the ties between Russia and China, the possibility of creating an economic bloc. But China does seem to be taking, at least on the diplomatic front, a bit of a step backwards.
Yeah, they're taking a very, very quiet position. And some of us within our sector are watching China very, very carefully because, our eye could be taken off the ball in terms of what Russia's doing and not necessarily notice what China might be doing. I mean, there are huge concerns about their potential invasion into Taiwan. That has always been on their sort of playbook list, if you like. So they are going to forge a very strong partnership with Russia. I think where we all feel very concerned, inevitably beyond Ukraine, is to the Russian people who are appearing to not be willingly engaged in supporting their leader, who are going to be suffering very, very badly, not just now, but into the future by the actions of their president.
OK. Will Geddes, good to talk to you.
Thanks,
Thank
Will.
you.